On the morning of May the 6th, 1527, Rome did not wake to church bells. It woke to screams. Steel clashed against stone in the narrow streets outside the Vatican. Smoke curled above the domes. Thousands of mercenaries flooded through the city like a living tide. Battle hardened, unpaid, and furious. And standing between them and the most powerful man in Christendom were 147 soldiers. They were not the strongest army in Europe. They were not the most numerous. They did not expect to survive. Yet what happened in the next few hours would become one of the most devastating last stands in military history. So absolute, so disciplined, that even their enemies would never forget it. This is the story of how 147 men crushed an empire's army not by winning, but by refusing to break. In the early 16th century, Europe was not a continent at peace. It was a pressure cooker. Every border was a fault line. Every crown rested on borrowed legitimacy, and every treaty was only as strong as the army willing to enforce it. The old medieval order was collapsing under its own weight. Feudal levies were giving way to professional soldiers, gunpowder was rewriting battlefield logic. Kings no longer fought for glory alone, they fought for money, territory, and influence over the soul of Europe itself. At the centre of this chaos stood two powers that could not coexist peacefully. The Holy Roman Empire, ruled by Charles V, stretched across Spain, Germany, the Low Countries, and much of Italy. It was the closest thing Europe had to a superstate, vast, wealthy, and permanently overstretched. Opposing it, though not with armies but with influence, stood the papacy, a spiritual empire that crowned kings, legitimised wars, and controlled unimaginable wealth. And between them lay Italy. Italy was not a nation. It was a prize, a mosaic of city-states, Florence, Venice, Milan, Naples, Rome, each rich, cultured, and militarily vulnerable. Whoever controlled Italy controlled trade, diplomacy, and prestige. And whoever controlled Rome controlled something far more dangerous, symbolic authority. The Pope was not just a religious leader. He was a king, a banker, a diplomat, and increasingly a political gambler. By the 1520s, Europe was already bleeding from religious fracture. Martin Luther's rebellion had cracked Christendom in half. Protestant ideas spread like wildfire across German lands technically loyal to the Holy Roman Emperor. And Charles V was fighting wars on multiple fronts, against France, against the Ottomans, against rebellion within his own empire. And those wars were expensive. To fight them, Charles relied not on patriotic national armies, but on mercenaries. Tens of thousands of professional killers drawn from Germany, Spain, and Italy, fighting not for loyalties but for pay. This was the great contradiction of early modern warfare. Empires needed soldiers, soldiers needed money, and when the money stopped, discipline died with it. By 1526, the imperial treasury was dry. Armies marched anyway, because once an army is in motion, it becomes a force of gravity. It must be fed, paid, or allowed to loot, and if none of those happens, it turns on whatever lies in front of it for it. Rome lay directly in its path. Pope Clement VII believed himself clever, and he believed diplomacy could shield him. He believed the prestige of the church would protect the eternal city. He was wrong. The army approaching Rome in 1527 was no longer fully under imperial control. Its commander, Charles de Bourbon, struggled to restrain men who had gone months without pay. German landsknechts, many of them Protestant, deeply hostile to the Catholic Church, marched beside Spanish veterans hardened by brutal campaigns. They did not see Rome as holy, they saw it as rich. As the army crossed into papal territory, discipline cracked. Orders were ignored, hunger sharpened tempers, the promise of loot replaced strategy. This was no longer a campaign, it was a storm. And Rome, ancient and unprepared, stood in its path with medieval walls, outdated defences, and one small force that would not retreat. Inside Vatican City, the Swiss Guard prepared. They had no illusions. They knew relief was not coming. They knew the walls would fall. They knew the enemy outnumbered them dozens to one, yet they polished armour. They sharpened halberds. They took communion. Because Swiss Guards did not measure victory by survival. They measured it by duty fulfilled. As dawn approached on May the 6th, fog settled over the Tiber River. The city held its breath. Somewhere beyond the walls, thousands of men loaded weapons, muttered prayers, and prepared ladders. Rome was about to learn what happens when political arrogance meets military desperation. and 147 men were about to step into history, not as conquerors, but as the line that would not bend. Long before Rome burned, long before the Vatican's stones were slick with blood, the reputation of Swiss soldiers had already taken shape in the nightmares of Europe's kings. To understand why 147 men could stand against an imperial army, we must first understand where they came from, because Switzerland did not produce warriors by accident. It forged them through geography, poverty, and relentless necessity. Switzerland in the late Middle Ages was not a unified nation-state. It was a loose confederation of mountain cantons, isolated valleys carved by glaciers, surrounded by hostile powers, and offering little in the way of fertile land. Life there was hard, winters were brutal, resources were scarce. Survival demanded discipline, cooperation, and endurance. These conditions shaped a people who could not rely on cavalry or castles. Their horses were expensive, stone fortresses were impractical in steep terrain. What the Swiss had instead were men, strong, stubborn, and accustomed to hardship, and a simple but devastating philosophy of war. Fight together or die alone. In the 14th century, Swiss infantry had already begun rewriting the rules of European warfare. At a time when armoured knights dominated the battlefield, the Swiss advanced not on horseback, but on foot, packed tightly in disciplined formations, wielding long pikes that turned cavalry charges into mass graves. The Battle of Morgarten, the Battle of Sempach, the Battle of Nancy. Again and again, Swiss foot soldiers shattered noble armies that had believed themselves invincible. Knights learned too late that courage and pedigree meant nothing against a wall of steel advancing in perfect rhythm. But what made the Swiss terrifying was not individual heroism, it was collective obedience. Swiss formations moved like machines before machines existed. Every man knew his place, every step was drilled. Panic was punished. Retreat without orders was unthinkable. The man next to you was not just a comrade, he was your shield, your anchor, your responsibility. And over time, Europe took notice. Kings did not fear the Swiss because they were cruel. They feared them because they were reliable. By the late 15th century, Swiss mercenaries were in constant demand. France, the papacy, the Holy Roman Empire, all competed for Swiss contracts. Entire cantons negotiated collective agreements, sending thousands of young men abroad to fight for foreign powers in exchange for gold that sustained their communities back home. But among all these contracts, and one stood apart. In 1506, Pope Julius II made a decision that would echo through centuries. Concerned for his personal safety and impressed by Swiss discipline, he invited a permanent contingent of Swiss soldiers to Rome, not as a temporary mercenary force, but as a standing guard sworn to protect the Pope himself. Thus, the Pontifical Swiss Guard was born. These men were not common hirelings, they were carefully selected, Catholic, unmarried, physically imposing and of proven character. Their loyalty was not to gold alone, but to an oath sworn before God, binding them to the life of the Pope. They trained relentlessly. They drilled within Vatican walls. They mastered both ceremonial appearance and brutal close-quarters combat. Their iconic uniforms, bright colours, Renaissance cuts, would later romanticize their image. But beneath the fabric were hardened soldiers prepared for violence at arm's length. The weapon of choice for the Swiss Guard was not the sword, but the halberd, a brutal hybrid of spear, axe, and hook. In confined spaces, against armoured opponents, it was devastating. It could pierce, cleave, and pull men from horseback or ladders in a single motion. More importantly, Swiss Guards trained to fight as a unit even when surrounded, even when outnumbered, even when retreat was impossible. This mindset was drilled into them from youth. Swiss military culture emphasized something rare in early modern warfare: discipline under annihilation. The goal was not always to win. Sometimes the goal was simply to hold, to delay, to buy time. That concept, sacrifice as strategy, would define their final stand. By the 1520s, though the Swiss Guard numbered only a few hundred men, they were not meant to fight wars, they were meant to protect one man, the Pope, and if necessary, to die doing so. Ironically, many soldiers in the army marching on Rome were also Swiss. These were mercenaries from other cantons, landsknechts and pikemen who shared the same martial heritage but fought for imperial pay. Some had trained in similar formations, some had fought alongside Swiss guards in earlier campaigns. On the battlefield outside Rome, brothers would soon face brothers, not by blood but by tradition. Yet the difference between them was profound. The imperial Swiss fought for wages they had not received. Their loyalty was eroded by hunger and resentment. Their discipline was cracking. The Swiss Guard fought for an oath they intended to keep, even if it cost them everything. And as Rome's defences crumbled, the Swiss Guard commanders understood the reality with chilling clarity. They could not stop the army, they could not save the city, but they could save time, time for the Pope to escape, time for history to remember something other than collapse. On the eve of the attack, the guards attended Mass. Confessions were heard, final letters were written. Armour was fitted not for survival, but for endurance. Outside the walls, the imperial army prepared to assault a city it barely understood. Inside the Vatican, a small group of men prepared for death with unsettling calm. They were not ignorant of fear, they were trained to walk through it, and when the first ladders rose against Rome's walls at dawn, the Swiss Guard would demonstrate something the modern world often forgets. That discipline, and when fused with belief, can turn human beings into something far more dangerous than numbers suggest. The fog along the Tiber began to thin, steel met stone, and the last stand of the Swiss Guard moved one step closer to inevitability. Pope Clement VII believed he was a survivor. Born Giulio de' Medici, he had grown up inside the most ruthless political machine of Renaissance Italy. The Medici did not rule Florence through brute force alone. They ruled through timing, alliances, and calculated betrayal. Giulio learned early that power was not held by the strongest man in the room, but by the one who waited longest before choosing a side. By the time he became Pope in 1523, Clement VII was convinced this skill would save him. Europe, however, was no longer a chessboard. It was a collapsing structure under stress, and Clement misread every crack. On paper, the Pope should have been the most protected figure in Christendom. Spiritually untouchable, politically indispensable. Rome itself carried an aura of sanctity that few believed any Christian army would dare violate. But Clement ruled during a moment when faith was fracturing, not unifying. The Protestant Reformation had shattered the illusion of a single Christian Europe. German princes openly defied Rome. Pamphlets ridiculed papal authority. Monks became revolutionaries. And the very idea that the Pope stood above politics was dissolving into public view. Clement responded not with clarity, but with hesitation. His greatest fear was not heresy. It was Charles V. The Holy Roman Emperor was young, ambitious, and dangerously powerful. He controlled Spain, Germany, the Low Countries, and vast overseas territories. If Charles dominated Italy, the papacy would become a decorative institution, ceremonial, obedient, and irrelevant. Clement could not allow that. And so he did what Renaissance rulers always did when trapped between giants. He played them against each other. In 1526, Clement joined the League of Cognac, an alliance formed specifically to check Charles V's power. France, Venice, Florence, Milan, former rivals united by fear of imperial dominance. On parchment, it was a masterstroke. In reality, it was a provocation. Charles V was already fighting too many wars to care about Rome's moral outrage. What he cared about was money, soldiers, and stability. And Clement's alliance threatened all three. The emperor did not immediately march on Rome. He didn't need to. He simply stopped paying his army in Italy. The imperial force stationed in northern Italy was enormous. Tens of thousands of men, many of them veterans. When their wages failed to arrive, resentment metastasized. So commanders lost control, discipline eroded, soldiers began demanding loot as compensation. Clement either failed to understand this, or believed the emperor would restrain his men out of respect for the church. Both assumptions were fatal. As the army began moving south, Clement hesitated again. He did not fortify Rome adequately. He did not evacuate early. He did not summon enough troops to defend the city. He trusted in diplomacy, precedent, and the symbolic immunity of the Vatican. Meanwhile, intelligence reports grew darker. Villages were being stripped bare, civilians were fleeing, churches were looted without hesitation. German landsknechts sang mocking songs about the Pope as they marched. Many of them were Lutheran. Some believed Rome was the seat of corruption that had poisoned Christianity. For them, marching on the Vatican felt less like sacrilege and more like justice. Clement still delayed. Part of his hesitation came from money. The papacy was wealthy, but its funds were tied to long-term investments, patronage, and bureaucracy. Raising a defensive army required immediate cash, and Clement feared draining the treasury for a crisis he still believed might pass. Another part came from psychology. Clement had survived exile before. He had seen power shift and shift back again. He believed Rome's prestige would force compromise at the last moment. It never came. When imperial forces reached the outskirts of Rome, Clement finally understood, but understanding arrived too late to change the outcome. Rome's defences were outdated. The walls were medieval, designed for sieges, not for cannon fire or mass infantry assaults. That the city's garrison was pitifully small. Many mercenaries hired in desperation were unreliable and underpaid. Only one force was fully prepared. Inside Vatican City, the Swiss Guard awaited orders with grim calm. They had no illusions about the Pope's political mistakes. Their duty was not to judge, but to protect. On the night before the assault, Clement took confession. He reportedly wept, not for the city, but for the realization that his choices had placed it in mortal danger. At dawn on May the 6th, as imperial troops surged toward Rome's walls, Clement watched from within the Vatican. The sound of artillery echoed through the city. Smoke rose beyond the hills, bells rang an alarm, and in that moment, Clement VII learned the truth that generations of rulers discover too late. That power without force is a promise no desperate army respects. The fate of Rome was no longer in the hands of diplomacy. It was in the hands of men holding halberds at the gates of St. Peter's Basilica, and their stand was about to begin. Armies do not collapse when they lose battles. They collapse when they lose purpose. By the spring of 1527, the imperial army marching on Rome was already spiritually broken long before it reached the city's walls. It was vast, battle-hardened and terrifying, but it was also starving, unpaid, and increasingly uncontrollable. This was not an army driven by strategy. It was an army driven by hunger. The force assembled under the banner of the Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork of contradictions. Spanish infantrymen, disciplined veterans forged in the Reconquista and wars against France, marched beside German Landsknechts, flamboyant mercenaries armed with pikes and early firearms, their loyalty tied only to the promise of coin. Many of these German soldiers were Protestant. Some were openly hostile to Catholic clergy. They carried pamphlets mocking the Pope, sang songs ridiculing Rome, and spoke openly about looting the city as divine retribution. Months had passed without pay. Commanders argued. Officers lost authority. Soldiers began settling disputes with fists and knives. Food was taken by force from the countryside, leaving behind burned villages and terrified peasants. When soldiers stop seeing civilians as human beings, a line has already been crossed. At the top of this unstable pyramid stood Charles de Bourbon, Constable of France turned imperial commander, a man of ambition, pride, and fatal misfortune. Bourbon understood the danger of his own army. He knew they were a powder keg waiting for a spark. His goal was not to sack Rome. His goal was to pressure the Pope into submission, force concessions, extract money, and restore discipline through victory. But armies do not always obey intentions. As they approached Rome, Bourbon faced an impossible dilemma. He could halt the advance and risk mutiny, or he could press forward and hope to control what followed. He chose forward. The night before the assault, the army camped within sight of Rome's walls. Rain fell, fires flickered. Soldiers sharpened blades, repaired armour, and whispered about the wealth awaiting them inside the city. Gold, art, relics, women, wine. The promise of Rome had become mythic. At dawn, Bourbon personally led the attack. Climbing ladders under fire, urging his men forward, he attempted to impose leadership through example. Then a bullet struck him. Accounts vary, but the result does not. Charles de Bourbon fell dead at the base of the walls, his blood soaking into the mud. In that instant, the last restraint vanished. The death of a commander during an assault is catastrophic. Orders fragment, units act independently. Soldiers no longer fight as an army, but as individuals with weapons. The imperial troops did not retreat. They exploded. Without leadership, discipline disintegrated completely. The assault intensified, fueled by rage, fear, and the intoxicating freedom of consequence-free violence. The walls were breached. Rome was no longer a city under siege. It was a city open. For the soldiers pouring through the gaps, this was not a battle. It was a reckoning. They believed they were owed something, and they intended to take it. Clergy were dragged from churches. Noble homes were forced open. Civilians were slaughtered without hesitation. The ancient capital of Christianity became a maze of screams and smoke. This was not the orderly looting of medieval warfare. It was a descent into primal chaos. And yet, amid the collapse, one force remained intact. As the city fell, the Swiss Guard moved. They did not attempt to defend Rome. They did not attempt to restore order. They knew both were impossible. Their mission was singular: protect the Pope. As the imperial horde surged toward the Vatican, the Swiss Guard took positions at strategic choke points, narrow streets, stairways, and courtyards where numbers meant less than formation. They formed ranks, they locked shields, they lowered halberds. Outside, the imperial soldiers howled in victory. Inside, 147 men prepared to die. The difference between the two forces was not weapons or experience, it was control. The imperial army had become a force of appetite. The Swiss Guard remained a force of intention. As the first waves of attackers approached St. Peter's, the guards did not shout, they did not break formation. They waited. And in that silence lay something more terrifying than rage. It was resolve. The sack of Rome had begun, and the last stand of the Swiss Guard was moments away. The sun rose slowly over Rome, filtered through smoke and mist, as if even the sky hesitated to witness what was coming. At first, the city did not fully understand what it was hearing. Rome had known sieges before. It had heard distant cannon fire in other wars, other centuries. But this sound was different, closer, angrier, irregular. The rhythm of controlled battle was missing. What echoed through the streets was chaos. When the imperial troops finally poured through the breached walls, there was no trumpet call announcing conquest, no formal declaration, just men running, shouting, firing, killing. The sack of Rome did not begin with strategy. It began with momentum. Soldiers surged forward in waves, driven by instinct more than orders. Some still carried ladders on their backs. Others dropped weapons just to run faster, and knowing they could take new ones from the dead. Civilians fled in every direction, clogging narrow streets, colliding with each other in blind panic. Doors were smashed open, churches were violated within minutes, altars were overturned, reliquaries shattered, sacred vessels ripped apart by hands that no longer cared whether they were holy or profane. Rome's defenders collapsed almost immediately. The city militia scattered. Mercenaries hired at the last moment either fled or joined the looters. Artillery crews abandoned positions when ammunition ran out. What little organised resistance existed dissolved under the weight of sheer numbers. Only one place held. As the city unravelled, the Vatican became an island of order surrounded by madness. St. Peter's Basilica, still under construction, and its massive dome unfinished, stood like a wounded giant. The square before it, wide and exposed, offered no cover. Any force defending it would be visible, isolated, and utterly surrounded. That is where the Swiss Guard took their stand. They formed ranks near the steps and entrances, their bright uniforms already streaked with dust and sweat. Halberds were braced. Faces were set. Their commanders issued final instructions, not shouted, but spoken calmly as if rehearsing for a drill they had always known would one day come. Inside the Vatican, Pope Clement VII was hurried toward the Passetto di Borgo, the narrow, elevated corridor that connected the Vatican to Castel Sant'Angelo. It was Rome's last escape route. But escape takes time the Pope did not have. The Swiss Guard understood this with absolute clarity. Every minute they held the attackers at St. Peter's was a minute Clement could put distance between himself and death. So they advanced. The first clash was brutal and immediate. Imperial soldiers, intoxicated by the victory elsewhere, charged without formation, only to slam into a disciplined wall of steel. Halberds struck with horrifying efficiency. Blades hooked armour, pulled men forward, crushed skulls. The Swiss Guards fought in tight formation, stepping forward as one, striking, stepping back, reforming. For a brief, surreal moment, the attackers hesitated. They had expected frightened clerics, weak resistance, easy slaughter. Instead, they found professionals, but numbers always matter, especially in open ground. The imperial troops regrouped and surged again, this time firing arquebuses into the formation. Smoke filled the air. Guards fell. Gaps opened, and were immediately closed by the men behind them. No one broke rank. Blood pooled on the marble steps of St. Peter's Basilica. Bodies, imperial and Swiss, piled together, indistinguishable beneath armour and cloth. From within the Vatican, Clement could hear the fighting. He could hear steel on steel, screams, the dull impact of bodies hitting stone. Every sound marked another second bought with a human life. As the Swiss Guard continued to hold, a smaller detachment began escorting the Pope through the Passetto. Torches flickered in the narrow corridor. The Pope stumbled, exhausted, terrified, guided by hands that knew their own fate was sealed. Back at the Basilica, the fighting intensified. The attackers began to encircle the guards. Arquebusiers fired from flanks. Pikemen pressed from the front. Though the Swiss formation shrank step by step, each retreat deliberate, each movement calculated to cost the enemy as much blood as possible. They were no longer fighting to survive. They were fighting to delay. One by one, guards fell. Wounded men refused to leave formation. Some fought until they could no longer lift their weapons. Others used broken halberds, daggers, bare hands. The square became a killing ground. By mid-morning, the outcome was no longer in doubt, but the timeline still was. And that was enough. As the last of the Swiss Guard near St. Peter's was overwhelmed, the Pope reached Castel Sant'Angelo. He was alive. Rome was lost. Of the 189 Swiss Guards on duty that day, only 42 would survive, most of them the ones who escorted Clement through the corridor. The remaining 147 died where they stood, not retreating. And not surrendering, not breaking. Their stand did not save Rome, but it saved something else, something more fragile. Time, and time was everything. When survival is no longer possible, something else takes its place. It is not hope. It is not courage in the romantic sense. It is clarity. For the Swiss Guard at St. Peter's, that clarity arrived not all at once, but in fragments. Each fallen comrade, each broken line, each moment when the weight of the enemy pressed harder than before. They understood what was happening. They were not winning, and yet nothing about their movement suggested defeat. The guards fought as if time itself had slowed, as if the chaos surrounding them existed in a different world. Commands were still given, signals were still passed, formation was still maintained, even as the formation shrank. This was not fanaticism. This was training reaching its final purest expression. Every Swiss Guard knew the geometry of his role. In open ground, the numbers favoured the enemy. But in tight spaces, stairs, porticos, entrances, the halberd became a weapon of terrible efficiency. Each step back was measured to draw attackers into narrower killing zones. Imperial soldiers rushed forward again and again, driven by the momentum of the sack. Many died simply because they advanced without coordination. Bodies piled so densely that attackers tripped over their own dead. But the pressure never stopped. Arquebus fire tore gaps through armour. Smoke choked the air. Visibility dropped. Guards began to fight half-blind, guided by shouted commands and muscle memory alone. At some point, the sound changed. The screams became constant. The clash of steel lost rhythm. Time dissolved into moments measured only by exhaustion. The Swiss Guard commanders adapted continuously. When a line weakened, and another absorbed it. When a man fell, the one behind him stepped forward without hesitation. Wounded guards were dragged back only when it did not endanger the formation, and often not even then. Some chose to remain. One account describes a guard whose arm had been shattered by a bullet, holding the line with his remaining strength until he was cut down. Another tells of men locking shields over fallen comrades, refusing to abandon the dead even when it cost them their lives. Whether every detail is literal matters less than what the pattern reveals. This was a force that refused psychological collapse. That refusal is what broke the rhythm of the attackers. Imperial troops were accustomed to enemies fleeing once the outcome was clear. That expectation shaped how battles ended. When it did not happen here, frustration grew. Though men shouted orders no one obeyed, officers tried to rally units that no longer listened. The Swiss Guard did not terrify the attackers by killing them, they unsettled them by not reacting as expected. This is something modern psychology would later formalize. When an opponent refuses to acknowledge fear, it destabilizes those who rely on intimidation. For a time, the Swiss Guard became an immovable object inside a city that had otherwise collapsed. But human bodies have limits. The guards were exhausted, dehydrated, surrounded. Ammunition captured from fallen enemies ran out. Armour grew unbearably heavy. Every strike demanded more effort than the last. Still they did not break, because by now the mission had narrowed to a single sacred question: has the Pope escaped? Yet when word finally reached the remaining guards that Clement had passed through the Passetto and reached safety, something subtle changed. They did not cheer, they did not relax, but their fighting shifted from resistance to finality. This was no longer about buying time, this was about keeping the promise. One by one, the last formation collapsed, not in panic, but under sheer physical annihilation. Guards fought until weapons snapped, until they were pinned, until they were crushed beneath numbers. Those who fell did so facing the enemy. By the end, the square before St. Peter's was unrecognisable. Blood darkened the stone, bodies lay in tangled heaps, smoke drifted lazily above the ruins. The imperial troops finally surged past what remained of the guard and into the Vatican complex. They were victorious. And yet, there's something about the victory felt wrong. They had expected a rout. Instead, they had been delayed, wounded, shaken. A handful of men had stood against an army and had not yielded. That kind of resistance leaves a mark. Long after the fighting moved on, witnesses would speak of the silence that followed, the unnatural quiet after so much noise, as if the city itself was stunned by what it had just seen. Rome was burning, but the Swiss Guard had done what they were created to do. They had held the line until the end, and in doing so, they transformed a military defeat into a moral shockwave that would echo far beyond the sack of Rome. After the fighting ended, Rome did not exhale. It simply bled. The steps of St. Peter's Basilica, once meant to elevate the faithful toward the sacred, were transformed into a place of death so dense that survivors later struggled to describe it without pausing. Blood pooled in the grooves of the stone. Armour lay twisted where bodies had fallen. Halberds, some snapped, some still clenched in lifeless hands, rested at unnatural angles, as if the fight had frozen mid-motion. There were no victory banners raised there, only silence. The imperial soldiers who passed through the square did so cautiously now, stepping around corpses with the uneasy awareness that they had just witnessed something rare. The men who had stood against them were gone, but their resistance lingered like a presence. Some soldiers crossed themselves, others spat, and a few simply stared. What unsettled them was not the loss of life. These men were no strangers to death. What unsettled them was that the Swiss Guard had died without asking for mercy. In the language of early modern warfare, this mattered. Mercy was part of the ritual of battle. A routed enemy begged. A broken formation surrendered. Death usually came after fear. Here, fear had been absent. Inside the Vatican, the aftermath unfolded in waves. The attackers looted what they could. Sacred objects were ripped apart. Chapels were violated. Priests were beaten or killed indiscriminately. But even in the depths of the sack, a strange boundary seemed to exist around the memory of the guard's stand. Some imperial soldiers reportedly avoided the steps of St. Peter's altogether, and others spoke of the fight later with an edge of respect that bordered on disbelief. They had expected priests and ceremony. They had met soldiers. The Swiss Guard did not vanish into anonymity after death. Their sacrifice became immediate knowledge inside Rome, passed from survivor to survivor, whispered among the hiding, shared in trembling voices. The Pope was alive. That single fact gave meaning to everything else. Clement VII, sealed inside Castel Sant'Angelo, learned of the guard's fate through messengers and fragments of reports. Those who had escorted him through the Passetto were wounded, shaken, and silent. He is said to have worn mourning black for weeks afterward. But mourning could not undo what had happened. Rome endured the sack for months. The city became a prison of hunger and terror. Disease spread. An art was destroyed or stolen. Entire families vanished. What had once been the symbolic heart of Christendom became a warning to Europe. Holiness offered no immunity, and yet amid this catastrophe the story of the Swiss Guard grew sharper, not softer. Their stand was retold not as a tragedy, but as a contrast. Rome had collapsed. They had not. This distinction mattered deeply in a century defined by instability. Kings rose and fell, cities burned, alliances dissolved overnight. But here was an example of something that had held under impossible pressure, not because it was ordered to, but because it had chosen to. Over time, the details became ritualized. The number, 147, took on symbolic weight. The location, the steps of St. Peter's, became sacred ground. The act itself was framed not as resistance, but as guardianship. Although the Swiss Guard had not defended stone or gold, they had defended continuity. Without them, the Pope would have been captured, or killed. The papacy itself might have fractured beyond repair at a moment when Europe was already tearing itself apart. That is the uncomfortable truth beneath the legend. Their death stabilized a collapsing system. In later years, enemies would still argue theology. Empires would still fight. But the image of the Swiss Guard standing fast became something both sides could recognize. Honour stripped of illusion. To this day, new Swiss Guards swear their oath on the May the 6th, not as a celebration but as a remembrance. They raise 3 fingers, symbolising the Trinity, and swear to defend the Pope even at the cost of their lives. Not metaphorically, literally, because once in 1527 that oath was tested, and it was not broken. The Passetto di Borgo is not impressive at first glance. It is narrow, enclosed, almost claustrophobic. A raised stone corridor stretching roughly 800 metres connecting the Vatican to Castel Sant'Angelo. From the outside it blends into the walls, easy to miss, easy to underestimate. On May the 6th, 1527, it became the most important corridor in Christendom. As chaos consumed Rome, Pope Clement VII was rushed from chamber to chamber inside the Vatican, his world shrinking with every step. The sounds of battle grew louder, too loud. Doors slammed, messengers ran, faces drained of colour. This was no ceremonial retreat, it was an escape. The Swiss guards assigned to the evacuation formed a tight protective ring around the Pope. These men would be among the only survivors of the day, not because they fought less fiercely, but because their mission demanded movement rather than resistance. Clement was dressed hastily, stripped of papal regalia, cloaked in anonymity. The symbolism of the moment was brutal. The spiritual leader of Western Christianity reduced to a fugitive inside his own capital. As they entered the Passetto, the sounds of Rome faded into echoes, muffled screams, distant gunfire, the dull thunder of destruction reverberating through stone. Torches flickered against the corridor walls, casting long shadows that stretched and twisted with every step. The Pope walked in silence. Behind him, men were dying to keep this path open. Every moment mattered. If the attackers reached the Passetto entrance before Clement emerged on the far side, escape would be impossible. The corridor offered protection, but only if time held. Inside Castel Sant'Angelo, the gates were thrown open just long enough to receive the fleeing party. Once inside, they slammed shut. Heavy bolts dropped into the place. Rome was sealed out. Clement collapsed, not in prayer, but in exhaustion. From the fortress walls, he could see smoke rising across the city. He could hear the chaos he had escaped, but not stopped. Castel Sant'Angelo would soon come under siege itself. Imperial troops surrounded it, demanding surrender. Food and water ran low. Disease threatened. Clement remained trapped for weeks, negotiating from a position of absolute weakness. He would eventually surrender. The terms were humiliating. Vast sums were paid. Political concessions were made. The Pope emerged diminished, alive but forever altered. Yet history does not remember Clement for his survival. It remembers the men who bought it. The Passetto did not save itself. It was made viable by blood spilled elsewhere. Without the Swiss Guards' stand at St. Peter's, Clement would have been overtaken before he reached the corridor. The papacy might have fallen into imperial hands. The Reformation-era power balance could have shifted catastrophically. Instead, the institution survived, wounded, but intact. This is the uncomfortable moral core of the story. The Swiss Guard did not save Rome. They saved continuity at a terrible cost. Their sacrifice allowed history to proceed along a familiar path, one already violent and fractured, but not utterly derailed. As Clement waited inside Castel Sant'Angelo, the echoes of battle faded into the long nightmare of occupation. Rome would suffer for months, Europe would watch in horror, and yet something had been fixed in memory. At a narrow corridor, a doom stand, a promise kept without expectation of reward. The Swiss Guard did not know how history would judge them. They only knew what their oath demanded, and they fulfilled it. Rome did not fall in a day. It decayed. After the initial violence, the sack of Rome settled into something far more disturbing than battle. A slow, grinding occupation where suffering became routine and cruelty lost its shock. The imperial army, leaderless and unpaid, spread through the city like a parasite that had found an unlimited host. What followed was not strategic destruction. It was consumption. Homes were stripped bare, families were ransomed repeatedly, sometimes until there was nothing left to give, sometimes until death ended the bargaining. Churches were desecrated not for ideology alone, but for materials. Gold leaf scraped from altars, silver melted down, relics smashed open, in search of hidden wealth. Rome's population collapsed under hunger, disease and terror. Plague followed filth. Bodies lay unburied. Their wells were poisoned by decay. The city that had once drawn artists, scholars, and pilgrims from across Europe became a cautionary tale whispered in distant courts. Even the victors suffered. The imperial soldiers, trapped in a ruined city, began turning on one another. Drunkenness, brawls, and murder spread through the ranks. Loot lost its meaning when there was no way to leave with it. Morale curdled into despair. This was the price of an army without restraint. Charles V, far away, received news of the sack with horror. Publicly, he distanced himself from the atrocity. Privately, he understood the damage was irreversible. The emperor had not ordered Rome's destruction, but he owned the consequences. The moral authority of the Holy Roman Empire was stained. The papacy emerged broken, humiliated, and politically cautious. But for decades afterward, popes would avoid direct confrontation with imperial power. Rome rebuilt, but it did so inwardly, defensively, more aware of its vulnerability than ever before. And across Europe the message was clear. If Rome could fall, nothing was untouchable. Yet amid this collapse, the story of the Swiss Guard did something unexpected. It stabilized memory. In a moment when institutions failed, armies, diplomacy, faith, the idea of personal duty endured. The Guards became symbols not of victory, but of integrity under annihilation. Artists depicted their stand, chroniclers preserved their names, the papacy institutionalized their memory, ensuring the Guards' role would never be reduced to footnote. This was not propaganda, it was necessity. Because societies recovering from trauma do not cling to their mistakes. They cling to their examples. Rome would eventually rise again. St. Peter's Basilica would be completed, grander than ever. The Vatican would regain influence. The Swiss Guard would continue to stand watch, quiet, ceremonial, unassuming. But every May 6th, beneath the pageantry, something darker is remembered. Not the glory, the cost. The men who died did not change the world by conquering it. They changed it by refusing to abandon their post when the world collapsed around them. That refusal became a line, drawn once but remembered forever. History is full of victories. Empires love to record them, parades, monuments, dates carved into stone. But victories age poorly, borders shift, flags change, the names of conquerors blur into one another. Last stands are different. They do not depend on outcome. They do not require success. They endure because they expose something raw about human choice. The stand of the Swiss Guard in 1527 is remembered not because they defeated an army, but because they faced certainty and did not flinch. That distinction matters. The men who died at St. Peter's did not believe they would be remembered. They had no audience beyond the men beside them. Their world had narrowed to formation, breath, and the weight of steel in their hands. They did not fight for glory. They fought because walking away would have broken something inside them long before the enemy ever could. This is why the story persists. In every era, societies ask the same quiet question. What holds when everything else collapses? In 1527, Rome collapsed. Authority failed, faith fractured, power revealed its emptiness, but a small group of soldiers demonstrated that duty chosen freely can outlast institutions built on fear or ambition. The Swiss Guard did not act because they were commanded to die. They acted because their oath meant something, even when it could no longer protect them. That is an uncomfortable lesson. Modern culture often treats sacrifice as spectacle or sentiment, but real sacrifice is rarely dramatic in the moment. It is repetitive, exhausting, often unnoticed. The Guards did not shout speeches. They did not make demands, they simply stayed. And staying when leaving is easier is one of the hardest human acts. This is why their memory is not confined to the Vatican. Military academies study them. Philosophers reference them. Psychologists point to them as an example of cohesion under extreme stress. Their stand reveals that morale is not built by optimism, but by shared meaning. The Imperial Army had numbers, they had weapons, they had momentum. What they lacked was a reason to hold together once discipline failed. The Swiss Guard had no such failure. Even today, their presence in Vatican City is symbolic, but not hollow. Every guard who takes the oath knows exactly what happened in 1527. The ritual is not metaphorical, it is historical instruction. This uniform has been soaked in blood before. This post has been held under impossible odds, and if necessary, it will be again. That knowledge changes how a man stands. The story also serves as a warning. Power without responsibility breeds catastrophe. Armies without pay become monsters. Leaders who gamble with forces they do not control risk devastation far beyond their intent. Rome paid that price, but within that devastation a line was drawn, quietly, permanently. The Swiss Guard did not stop history from turning. They stopped it from breaking completely. 5 centuries later, the world is different in technology, language, and scale, but the human core remains unchanged. We still face moments where leaving is safer, easier, and more rational. And we still remember those who stayed, not because they were perfect, but because they were faithful to something larger than themselves. That is the legacy of 147 men who stood on stone steps and refused to move. Not because they thought they would win, but because they knew who they were. If this story moved you, like the video, subscribe for more cinematic history and tell us in the comments, what does duty mean in your life? Because history does not only belong to the past, it lives wherever someone chooses to stand when it would be easier to walk away.